everybody. My name is Matt Cook, and I am the director of the Center for Healthy Churches. I'd like to welcome you to the Changing Church webinar. The hope for this webinar is that this is a space in which we ask and answer interesting questions about how the church in the 21st century might adapt, might think creatively about the ways that it carries out its ministries in ways that's different than the past, that probably also stretches us and challenges us. We're always grateful to have a wonderful panel with us. I will introduce them in a moment, but before I do, I want to thank all of the partners that help make this webinar a reality. We are grateful, as always, for the good work of PneuMatrix. Their co-principals, Jim Kitchens and Deborah Wright, are on with us this morning. We are grateful for the good work of Truett Seminary and the Truett Church Network, of the Gardner Webb Divinity School, of the Lake Institute for Faith and Giving, for the Church Network, for Baptist News Global, whose executive director and my good friend is on with us this morning. So Mark Wingfield, it's good to have you, and I'll introduce him a little bit more as a panelist in just a moment. So today our topic is, actually we're looking forward. We always in December, we do one where we're looking backward and one we're looking forward, and we have 4 outstanding panelists that will help us with that in no particular order. I was going to do alphabetical order, but they all, basically they're all clustered at the rear end of the alphabet. So Karen Rohrer is the director of the Center for Adaptive and Innovative Ministry at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. Karen, it is wonderful to have you with us this morning. Bill Shiell is the president of Northern Seminary in Chicago, where he also serves as professor of pastoral theology and preaching. Michelle Snyder is a consultant with the Center for Healthy Churches, as well as PneuMatrix, and leads a suicide prevention program called Soul Shop. And Mark Wingfield serves as the executive director and publisher of Baptist News Global. So an ecumenical group of very intelligent people that hopefully are going to say things provocative and interesting about what they think might be coming. So the way that we're going to kind of do this a little bit is I'm just going to ask a question and give all 4 of you an opportunity to answer that question. And we'll go in one order on question 1, and then we'll go in reverse order on question 2. And so, Karen, you get to be the very first one to answer the questions this morning. So what trend or phenomenon from your perspective and in the spaces in which you live and operate and socialize, what trend or phenomenon are you watching that worries you for the church in 2023 and beyond, and why? We're going to start off challenging and with a little bit of gloom, and then end with hope. So
I can do that. Start out with a little bit of gloom. Thank you so much for having me. I was thinking about this, and at first I thought, we're dealing with pastoral exodus and pastoral burnout. And so we kind of have a leadership crisis, and I was leaning towards that, but I actually think that that's a symptom of something larger, which is that we as a society are having a hard time sitting with the grief and the trauma and the fatigue and the anxiety of what we've all just been through. And I think that's exacerbated in church because church for so many is their home space or their safe space. So churches are having a hard time listening to things that are disconfirming across the board. And that is causing communication breakdowns, I think, between people in churches. We're seeing church splits, but also between leaders and churches. And I think we are struggling to build up our capacity for hard things again. And so we can't sit still in it, and we're running around and running away. And I think that's really concerning for community building across the board.
Bill, what about you? And you're still muted, so.
Thanks, Matt. And thanks for the invitation to be at this virtual table. I would say on my end, just practically, one of the things that churches are facing right now is giving at most is going up only 3% year over year. That's the latest data I've seen from the Tony Morgan Group. And because giving is not keeping pace with inflation, the challenge of not only retaining staff you have, adequately compensating, but then also developing the new ministries that are necessary in this season right now are pressing further on, especially mid-sized in smaller congregations. I think the staff turnover piece has sort of leveled off a bit in the larger congregations, but the smaller churches are having an even harder time retaining persons who are gifted for ministry, and then also developing a leadership pipeline around that. And the good news, though, that I've seen in that space is that those who are in ministry at this point, at least in congregational life, are saying, I'm really committed. If I've made it this far, I'm going to try to make it the next 6 months, the next year or two. So there's sort of a leaning in there. The other positive thing that we're seeing in my space, and we've seen a little bit of this data in Barna as well, is that the fastest growing group of people returning to in-person activities in congregational life are actually millennials and younger. And so even though that's been the two generations that it's hardest for us to reach, there is an uptick in in-person gatherings from those age demographics. So there's some signs of life there. There's still challenges, but I'm hopeful that churches are beginning to adapt to that.
Do you remember where you saw that data, Bill, about millennials returning to church?
Yeah, Barna released the most recent data I saw on that, and on their website. I checked it again yesterday just to confirm what I'd heard through the grapevine, but also I've experienced that myself. I've seen that here, that's a trend in the Midwest for sure.
Yeah, but for what it's worth, I'd also confirm that giving, that financial piece in the churches that I'm working with, a lot of churches in the early stages of the pandemic, it was better than they thought it was going to be. And now as they're emerging from it, it's actually worse. So that's a pretty common refrain that I'm hearing at the moment. Michelle, what about you from your vantage point?
So we're probably not supposed to crosstalk, but Bill, just to clarify real quick, are you saying they're returning to worship or they're returning to activities? Or is that
good question. What I'm seeing is it's activities and in-person gatherings and some worship. Like of all the generations, that it appears to me that we can't find the boomers, and there are a lot of senior adults who are trying to get back into worship. But of all the generations, the ones that's coming back faster to being available and accessible at church are millennials and younger. So Gen Z. And so there seems to be some kind of hunger to be together. Now, whether that's happening in worship or not, I'm not sure. But that just there's a desire to be in community associated with the church.
And Michelle, feel free to crosstalk. All of our panelists, feel free.
And feel free
to correct today is an interesting conversation. So
yeah. All right. Yeah. So the trend that I'm seeing is it's not a new trend, and it's not a COVID trend. It's just an increasingly concerning trend for me, which is that I'm finding that what most of our mainline congregations, at least the ones that I work with, seem unable to conceive of is that they seem to be entirely designed around a baby boomer ethos. That there's a way in which institutionalism is the DNA, a way in which the trunk of the tree is about joining and involvement and doing more. And so even as they try to innovate, I hear their innovation around how do we get people to fill in the blank? How do we get people to serve in meaningful ways? How do we get people to come to things? And I've started saying to some churches, just to poke them a little, you don't have a problem getting young families into the church. If you gave out free massages and gift cards, you would not have a problem getting young families. It's that people don't need more things to do who are my age and younger. We need to be we're exhausted. What do we do in a world where we're exhausted and the church isn't a place of refuge or respite because it's a place where there's further obligation and more to do, and giving to the institution and involvement in the institution is kind of the only way that we know how to conceive what it is to be church. I don't see churches making that pivot. And so I think that many of their changes are what they're attempting, even as they think they're being strategic, is tactical, because they're not tackling that particular DNA question.
Yeah, note to self, collaborative efforts between congregations and Swedish massage therapists.
Sign
bingo
me
cards
up.
for 2023. So,
yeah.
Mark, you're up. What about you?
Hey, everyone. I want to say a quick word about where I am. If you're wondering what's behind me, I'm sitting in Uptown Dallas at Oak Lawn United Methodist Church, which runs a coffee shop called Union Coffee. And I'm sitting on the patio at Union Coffee with the church behind me here. And this is a fascinating church that I think illustrates the model for how an inner city kind of congregation survives, and not only survives, but thrives. Yesterday and the day before, there were 2 busloads of migrants from the border who arrived in this parking lot behind me, and volunteers from the community were here in this place, welcoming them and helping getting them to their next destination. This is a community-based congregation that has an open door policy during the week. Anyone can go walk in the building. They're not blocking people out, right? And so that's a whole nother thing. I chose this place on purpose today. Unfortunately, it's in the flight pattern of Love Field. So if you hear an airplane, that's what's going on. So I wrote a piece earlier this week that I think is my answer to this question. And that is, I think this is going to be a year of suddenly realizing we have a lot of mismatch between churches and existing church staff. People who have been able to sort of get by before the pandemic and sort of were befuddled and had to find their way through during the pandemic. Now, as we're coming through into this moment, and I speak as someone who's hired a lot of church staff, and some of those I regret hiring now that I'm not there to clean up the mess that I made, right? There's a plane. Thank you, Southwest Airlines. But I think the churches that I see are now at a point where they're not going to be able to tolerate dead wood on staff. There's just not enough margin to do that. And you have a lot of lovely, kind, compassionate people who are not equipped to do what they need to do today. They are equipped to do what they needed to do 15, 20 years ago, one thing, and they know how, what I call 1 year of experience 20 times. They know how to repeat, to copy and repeat from year to year and year. But we're now at a point of adaptation that's going to happen if a church is going to thrive, staff in particular. And senior pastor, yes, but I'm particularly talking about everyone else on the staff beyond the senior pastor is going to have to, I mean, the days of silos, I just don't think silos are nasty to begin with. I don't think you can survive with a silo mentality today, because collaboration is absolutely essential. So I think this reckoning that's coming next is down a notch on church staff to realize we have a lot of mismatches of people, and I'm not sure what we do about that.
So we're going to make the pivot, Mark, and come straight back to you. So we've started off with kind of what's hard, like some things that we're worried about a little bit. So let's turn and let's look at some things that might be harbingers of hope in some ways. If you got to pick a phenomenon that you think would have the biggest impact on the church if it were to catch on or grow in influence, what would it be and why, Mark?
Well, this is the hardest question of the day to me, because I'm just a bit of a skeptic all the way around these days, and these are challenging times, as you know. And I have the unique perspective of having been a church staff member, an associate pastor, executive pastor for 17 years, and then stepping back and actually still being a member of the same church, which, by the way, is a very hard thing to do, Phil Martin. I don't advise this for everyone. However, I am amazed, to pick up on some of the other threads, that as many people are coming back to church as are, right? Because it was so difficult for so long to see who was going to come back. And we're still, I mean, that's a process still going on. This past Sunday, I saw people at church I've not seen in 2.5 years. But we were all in the same room together because there was a big event, right? And so I'm realizing that there's still more capacity to come in on that. My wife teaches, she substituted Sunday in the kindergarten class at Sunday school, and she teaches a preschool children's choir. And they've all of a sudden, just in the past few weeks, had more kids coming back in with those classes than have been there in 2.5 years. And I really was writing off the young families because they just weren't re-engaging, but now all of a sudden they are. And this goes to Bill's point. It's anecdotal, really, but I think there's some signs of hope that they're just glimmers at this point. And I don't even know they can be quantified, but the return to church is not over. Right. The story is not yet written on how that's going to play out. It took us 2 years to get in this mess. It's probably going to take us more than a day or two to come out of it as well. And I think all of us just sort of wanted to say, oh, well, let's turn on the lights, open the doors, everyone's back. It's not working that way. It is a slow thing back in. And I don't know where that's going, but I think there's more hope than I thought there was 3 months ago.
Walk to the light, Mark. Walk to the light. It's we're heading in that
I'm sorry. I'm drawn to the darkness.
Yeah. All right, Shiell, your opportunity. Like, if something caught on that is not yet a full-blown phenomenon that you think actually had the opportunity to have the biggest positive impact for the church, what would that be?
I think social entrepreneurship. I think the use of our facilities for the sake of mission and revenue through community collaboration, I think, is where I see pockets of life. I think our buildings are increasingly our primary asset. I think as our membership gets smaller, maybe even older, but also how we conceive of what it is to be church. I think we can't count on the offering plate to bring in what we need financially. I think we can't count on our people to be the primary doers of mission. And I think it's not as effective anyway. It's in some ways what Mark's talking about with this coffee shop. So I think that the opportunities are bottomless, and I'm seeing some really good flickers of what that can look like.
Bill?
Yeah, just to tag on to everything that's been shared, such wisdom here. To add to that, one thing out of the ashes of what I'd call the attractional church collapse, Willow Creek, Harvest, there are several examples of discipleship movements that are cropping up. Some of this is what I kind of call the MacGyver approach to discipleship. There are a lot of people still wanting to be engaged in people's lives, and something is emerging out of that is not going to lead to more celebrities. It's actually going to lead to micro church movements and small gatherings that I think smaller traditional churches that have great social capital can actually tap into. And that's giving me a lot of hope. The other thing that I'm seeing, especially in urban contexts, is churches who've decided to say, okay, we're going to do something about gun violence, and we're going to do something about interrupter programs in the name of Jesus. So we have a faculty member, for instance, working on the Sankofa Wellness Village in West Garfield Park, where every morning there are 20 ex-gang members gathering for a Bible study who have left behind one lifestyle and have said, what does it mean to live into something new? The third area that I think is really interesting is some of the early data we're seeing and stories we're hearing from the He Gets Us project. I'm sure you've seen a commercial or two about hegetsus.com. What's fascinating to me about this is the people who are responding. And by the way, people are responding to this. If a church signs up for referrals, they get referrals. But what we're hearing is the people who are being referred are folks facing, no surprise to the folks on this call, mental health issues, homelessness, housing insecurity, food insecurity. So churches that are prepared to address mental health are going to be well positioned if they want to be a part of this awakening of these new expressions and movements, because that is exactly where the kingdom of God seems to be taking root again and providing great opportunity for churches who have an imagination around this. And it doesn't have to be a mega church to have the capacity. In fact, the smaller churches do better in this space than some of the larger churches.
Yeah, I want to, I'm not going to echo every single time, but if I had a nickel for every time the words church and mental health in a positive frame have popped into the same conversation in the past few months, that there's something bubbling up right now from my vantage point. I want to add to that. So, Karen, from your perspective, how would you answer that question?
Sure. So, I mean, what I'm thinking is really related to the mental health thing, but I would make it broader. I have seen a little bit during COVID comfort in speaking about real and hard things. And that includes mental health, but it also includes illness. It includes isolation. It includes all the things that have been hard about COVID, just a little more candor and ability to speak to those things. And in some faith communities, to speak theologically and vulnerably to those things, to risk actually making a claim about God being active in the midst of that, or even wondering where God is in an open-handed, not prescriptive, not didactic kind of way, but rather just in a personal, honest, confessional kind of way. And to me, being able to speak the truth of our own spiritual experience, especially in the midst of hard things or in the midst of a crisis, when we're sharing space with someone who's suffering, when we're sharing space with someone who's been through something hard, can be really transformative for our communities. And it's one of the things that, especially in the main line, we've neglected because we were afraid of looking coercive. And so we do not tell the stories of our own spiritual experience, and we're afraid to listen to other people's spiritual experiences, because what if it doesn't fit in our orthodoxy box? Then are we going to have to fix them? And I think the trend that I'm seeing is like the risk to step out and actually say, no, this is what I've experienced. This is what I believe about God, and build those vulnerable connections in that way. And I think that helps us to actually tell the story and make space for what God is actually doing, not what we imagine in our little box might be possible for God to do. And it also allows us to welcome people beyond the church and offer space for their stories to be valid too. So that's given me a lot of hope. But I also know that it's hard. And I've been fascinated by the groups that are risking this and the groups that struggle to risk this, that I've kind of been a part of.
So one of the things that I've been paying attention to for a while now, and it is this, and I use the phrase or the word fragmentation to kind of describe this phenomenon. And I want to invite the four of you kind of join me in doing some observational work as far as that's concerned. In some ways, it's not new. It's what happened with postmodernity. We go from big monolithic ways of framing things and seeing the world, to even defining truth, to hyper individualism in some ways. But it's not just that. I think there's more to it than that. My question is, we continue to see the fragmentation of American Christianity in a variety of ways, from large heterogeneous bodies that experience conflict into smaller, more cohesive bodies, groupings, networks. The two that I'm watched closely in 2022 was American Methodism has been doing that in slow motion for years now. Like we've all watched as these forces were at play. But we're also watching it happen in American evangelicalism in a lot of ways. So it's a right and left phenomenon. It's kind of across the spectrum. So from your perspective, and Karen, we'll start with you and work backward, just like we did with the first question. What do you make of the trend? What good and bad should we expect as a result of this kind of fragmentation? I don't think it's all positive. I mean, it's all negative. There might be some silver linings. What do you think about that, Karen?
Well, this has been haunting me, especially as it relates to the institutional church. And that is because, like, I live a fairly fragmented life myself. So I'm in my mid-30s, and as an adult, I've lived in 4 different cities. And I have friends and communities that I am deeply connected to from each place. I have social media people that I'm following that kind of take up space in my spirit, even though I haven't seen them in years. And if you think about, I don't know if you all are familiar with Dunbar's number, but this theory that we can kind of hold 150 people and not much more in our immediate circle, that the experience of moving and having communities in different places, the experience of social media where I'm connecting to people that I'm not geographically connected to, the experience of needing to leverage a variety of networks to get where I need to go, means that my social energy, which could maybe be concentrated 50 years ago in an 150 member congregation where I can like show up and give, 150th of that community's labor and attention to that group, is now diffuse everywhere. And I'm exhausted. And I want the amount of people that I want to care for and walk through life with is not sustainable for me to do, and also work as much as I need to work to like keep my head above water. So I want to say that part of this fragmentation has to do with the fact that we are being asked to participate in way more systems than we're actually able to hold. And we are longing for something smaller. And so we fight with each other as a sort of reaction to being overwhelmed, and try to make the boundaries more containable. So it's something that we can hold. That's kind of my theory about why it's happening. It also has huge impacts on the church because, I go to a mid-sized church. 50 years ago, I would have been able to bring more energy to it. Were I living in the social constructs that were available then. Now, I don't bring very much energy at all. And so this church that's used to being sustainable with 200 people is really struggling to sustain, because the 200 people they are gathering now are way more diffused. That scares me. I also think that there's real power in small communities, power for belonging that hasn't been accessible to institutional church in the way that we've designed it, because it's been so program heavy. It's not been genuinely sharing vulnerable space, having deep conversations, doing the human things together. So these micro communities that are emerging have the possibility for that. And I'm excited about that. And there's also a possibility for accountability in smaller groups that way, within the group, but connecting them across those lines and actually making big systemic change, which I think is really, really necessary in the church world, but also in the world, is really hard. And so that's a challenge of this, is that, we feel like we're belonging, but it also blocks us from building broader alliances that don't have the ideological purity we're used to looking for to actually make big sweeping changes in the world. There's a sort of divide and conquer, union busting thing afoot in our capitalist world that happens to us there, I think.
So I want to, I guess, underscore that in some ways, or just in some ways just think out loud. I mean, so I think probably everybody who's with us today probably is aware of the phenomenon of, changing attendance patterns in churches. Highly committed members in the 20th century oftentimes were at church 3 times a week, or 3 times on Sunday. 3 times a week, and now it's 3 times a month. And they still consider them highly committed. And Karen, what you're saying is, even when they're there, their world is diffuse and fragmented, that even when they're there, there's less of them there even when they're there, which is to take it one more step further in terms of kind of keeping the ceiling low on engagement and energy and things like that. So is that what I hear you saying?
I think that's absolutely right. And I think that our ingrained habits of being a bit surface level exacerbate that. So that wasn't so much of a problem when we were there all the time. We could kind of settle into being present. We're not there as often. We need to be really doing grounding stuff in the space to actually be present there.
Right. Bill, what about you? What would you say about the fragmentation of American Christianity, challenges and silver linings, if there are any?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the latest wave, I guess, I don't have any, dramatic insight on this. I think what I would say is the conversations that most Methodist pastors I talk to, for instance, or Baptist pastors are having are not the conversations happening on Twitter about these issues. That things they're having very localized. How can I keep my church together through this? And so there's, a very local sense of no matter what's happening in the social media universe or votes by denominations, we're just trying to stay together. And there's going to be about a third of us to a fourth of us who've kind of said, if you don't vote my way, I'm leaving. And that's new, because I think 10 years ago when we went through these things, there was a sense of a desire that the local body of Christ was going to still try to member each other through this. But now there's sort of a very strident group on various issues that says, you know what, if this doesn't come down, or if we decide not to take a vote or whatever, we're going to have a scattering. And so I think the silver lining you asked about that is, well, we're sort of in a rescattering, a diaspora moment for the American church, along with, as Mark alluded to, this sort of immigration wave that's happening, where there are people who are scattering in neighborhoods and communities that really want to be a part of local bodies of Christ, but are feeling exiled. And so there's an opportunity there. It's not what it was. It's not the same. But the challenge is, while we are dealing with these larger denominational votes and resorting and re-identification of who we are, we don't have the energy to address some of the other issues that are going on with, say, for instance, younger people who have said, I don't even know what a church is. Yeah. So that's the only insight that I would offer. I think some of this echoes a bit of the 1919 and 1920s. I mean, this feels like fundamentalism reborn with nationalism and all the attending issues that come with that. So I'm learning and thinking deeply about all those things. My seminary was a product of some of that. So, I'm thinking about how we can lean into it and address it.
Shiell?
I find your question so multidimensional and complex that I'm almost paralyzed by it. I think because it takes so many words to unpack what you're saying. Because we're talking about fragmentation sort of at the macro level, I hear Bill talking about national denominational schism. And as a part of a denomination that has already done that, I just see, I don't think there are strengths that don't have shadows and vice versa. But I think one of the strengths of that in my denominational context is that we get to talk about something else. Sort of the we'll stay together at absolutely all costs means that we have one issue that we fight about, and it's a values-based conflict that's not going anywhere. And so it becomes an impasse to other mission and ministry. And I think the upside of it is that we can get on with other stuff. I think another upside of getting smaller and more specific and more like-minded is the ability to lean into the esoteric. I have a colleague who started a church that, it didn't kind of start this way, but ended up being almost primarily for African-American lesbians. And it's a very small subgroup that ended up going online so that it could go national, and it's got its strengths and shadows, but there's kind of an interesting ability to lean into where you are and be there. I don't think it's an answer to your question, but just a kind of personal story is that I'm a little bit bored these days by the institutional church and the stuff we're churning out. And so I church consultant on the road all the time. I'm not terribly plugged into a local congregation in meaningful ways. And I had a colleague who said to me once, what is the kind of church that would capture your attention? And I just kind of came out with one that asked everything. And I think what I long for is a much more communal, deep engagement around high accountability and intimate connection. And so I think the more fragmented has kind of a negative connotation, but the smaller we get, the more house church we get, whatever form that takes, the more intimate we get, the higher the stakes of the gospel, the higher the stakes the relationships can be, and the more we can ask of each other. And I think, even as I've said, I'm exhausted and I'm busy and I want somebody to take care of me, I also want a church that asks way more of me than my church does. And I think I find that in smaller communities of accountability and partnership, of intimate relationship. So that's all over the map, but that's how I fragment when you ask about fragmentation.
I'm going to resist the temptation to piggyback on that, because I've got a couple more questions I want to ask. But Mark?
Wow, I agree. This is such a multidimensional question. I want to say three things just briefly on things that have been said. Back to Dunbar's theory on relationships. So true. And 150 is the max. I mean, that's including just acquaintances, right? So most of us have a much smaller group. I recently taught a Sunday school lesson on this, off the passage, "A friend loveth at all times, and a brother is born for adversity." What does this mean, right? How many people can you really keep close to you for those moments? And I like to think of this like a Lego brick, like a basic, the bumps on the Lego brick, the basic building one has 8 bumps on it that you can attach other things to. And I think of yourself as having 8 deep relationships maybe that you can connect to individually or even organizationally, right? And one of the things I've had to repent of in the past 2-3 years after I've left the church staff where I was the program propagator is I now understand my expectations were unrealistic for this age. I expected the people to be as invested in the life of the church as I was, because back to one of the questions that's been in the chat, I was needing to perpetuate the system because I was dependent upon it, right? Mm-hmm. And so this all sort of feeds into this thing at the same time. Then over to Bill's point about, the larger fragmentation, one of the things I see about the fragmentation of different types of churches is that people who are in those different types of churches think everyone else in Christianity believes what they believe. And they are shocked, astonished that not everyone who is a Christian believes just like they do, because they are so insulated in their world that they don't really, get that at all. And then the third thing, oh my God, this is it. So in my current situation, one of the ways I stay in touch with sort of the pastoral function is I do a lot of what I call pickup funerals. Every week I'm working for a funeral home, doing funerals for people I've never met before who have no church and no minister. And one of the things I've learned about all these families, here in Dallas at least, is very few of them are unchurched. They are all de-churched. Mm-hmm. And there is a big difference here. They all have a basis of a relationship in the past with a church. Sometimes, I did a service recently for a 90-year-old woman. It was on a Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. And one of the chief attributes her family talked about was how she was a children's Sunday school teacher and a tither to her church. And I thought, where the heck is the church, right? She has completely disconnected from them in such a way that a stranger is standing up at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning to officiate her service. And this is the ultimate definition to me of being de-churched. People are dropping off. We're losing them from the connection to the church so that they don't even call us up for their funeral, right? And this is another element of the fragmentation.
So we are running short on time. This has been rich and wonderful. I do want to end with a word of hope, with words of blessing. So we're gonna, for the last question that we're gonna go, Mark, we're gonna start with you. Is other than your own, and let me say, Baptist News Global is doing fantastic fantastic work. So I would certainly direct you to pay attention to the fine work at Baptist News Global. But other than the work of Baptist News Global, what other institutions, organizations are doing the most innovative, hopeful work in American Christianity right now, in your perspective?
You know, there's so many working in different little niches along the way. I'm a huge fan of Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, BJC, that's really focused on the true meaning of religious liberty. I think that's an urgent issue. But there's also a right-wing group that I'm paying attention to, because they're getting some stuff right. There's a group online called Ministry Watch that is a watchdog group for ministries, and they are far to the right of where I am, but they're doing some really interesting reporting that's accountability reporting on some of these things, and I get all sorts of story leads from them, not necessarily the way they would anticipate, but some. The point of that is that I think there's some unexpected sources from people who are not like us, who, you know, still get it right on some things. And it's important to hear from that perspective as well.
Michelle?
Yeah, I'm really impressed by the Center for Jubilee Practice. This was actually just highlighted in the Presbyterian Outlook this week. They're started by Rick Ufford Chase and Ashley Dittar-Burt, asking questions about reparations, helping churches think about how they be a part of the work of reparations, inclusion, and ecumenism. And they're doing it in collaboration with the Presbytery of Utica, which took a big part of their reserves to get this organization launched. So even the act of Utica's Presbytery helping get them started was in some ways was about reparations. So I'm pretty impressed by what they're doing.
Bill?
I am intrigued by the rise of the marketplace chaplains and corporate chaplains movements that are going on. There are a couple of different organizations. One is Corporate Chaplains of America. The other is Marketplace Chaplains. I do think the workplace is one of the places that, as the church is reborn, it's going to happen through workplace conversations and addressing workplace stress and being present with people in the midst of really difficult times right now. These people are the real deal, and I'm impressed with their work, able to plug a gap with church members and their lives that I think pastors are well served if they listen carefully more to what's happening on Monday to their membership rather than on Sunday. And I think they're doing some really good work and helpful work.
And last but not least, Karen, what about you?
This is niche work, but I think it's a model for an impulse that is valuable. The Black Church Food Security Network, I absolutely love. They're out of Baltimore, but are now up and down the Mid-Atlantic and East Coast. And the idea was to build food sovereignty for local Black churches. In the wake of Freddie Gray, food couldn't get into the school children because of the uprising. And that was a reminder that food sovereignty is the way to sustain oneself in an adversarial system. And so it has been a movement of building gardens on church lawns and using church property, but also connecting with Black farmers to do farmers markets in Black churches. The leader's a guy named Reverend Dr. Heber Brown, who I just think is the absolute best. Brilliant guy, very thoughtful, and doing this kind of grassroots thing. Started it through his church, which is like a small Baptist church in Baltimore, and is now full-time with the Black Church Food Security Network. But I particularly like it because it's not for the saving of the church, it's for the nourishment of the people. And thinking that way and that impulse, I think, is really powerful and helpful.
So one of the things that one of the insights that has emerged out of some recent reading I'm doing is that homogeneity makes us dumb, that the American church has lots of problems, but most of the problems that we encounter are actually have to do with the fact that the fractious nature of American Christianity, in some ways, while it is a shadow, is also our strength. that there are these things that happen that out on the edges, and then they become signs of hope. And one of the reasons we ended in the way that we did is for you to hear about 4 very different kinds of places, institutions, movements in American Christianity, is so that you would have a sign of hope that emerges up out of all of our diversity. I think there's strength in that for us. Thank you to our panel. You know why that they were asked to do it. They all had tremendous insights. We turned on the fire hose. We went really, really fast, covered a lot of ground. We could have asked one question, camped out on it the entire time. Hopefully what you got is at least a nugget of insight and awareness of something, something to chew on after this webinar is over, and maybe chew on for a little bit longer than you normally would. We're taking several weeks off for the holidays, so we won't be back until after the first of the year. So thank you for all those of you who are regulars for this webinar. We're glad to have you. Hopefully this conversation all year long has been beneficial for you. And if you're with us just for the day, we're grateful for that as well. Be looking for things on our website that will be talking about the return of the Changing Church conversation after the first of the year. My thanks to our panelists. My thanks to all of you for being with us. Everybody, happy holidays.